foreign ministers from the G20 top economies have gathered in Johannesburg amid geopolitical rifts, tensions over the Ukraine war, and the top U.S. diplomat a notable absentee. President Cyril Ramaphosa told G20 foreign ministers that multilateralism and international law are key to solving world crises, while sounding an alarm about the group's deepening divisions. He said he believes that South Africa and the United States could still work together and find solutions to their differences. South Africa, like many African nations, is integrated into global trade networks, making it susceptible to external economic pressures. Tariffs from a major economy like the United States could harm South Africa's exports, especially in industries like agriculture, manufacturing and mining. And the risk now is whether South Africa would adjust or abandon its policies to avoid economic consequences, which could be seen as a compromise of sovereignty. Now, joining us virtually to discuss the potential erosion of such sovereignty in Africa is Mbasa Mvenene, Senior Lecturer at the Walter Sisulu University. Mr. Mvenene, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning to you, sir, and thanks for having me.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. Now, sovereignty is, I would say, a very important facet of any country's administration, because it simply means that a state or governing body perhaps has the ultimate authority and power within its own territory. Now, to what extent do economic sanctions or tariff threats undermine a country's sovereignty? Does South Africa even have enough economic resilience to withstand US tariffs, or does this sort of create a dependency dynamic?
In terms of dependency on the US, I mean, we must admit that the US is a world hegemon. I mean, the US is a superpower militarily and economically. And if the US were to use sanctions or even trade embargoes against South Africa, this would definitely damage and harm the South Africa's economy and South Africans generally. But I think this, if it gets to that point, this presents an opportunity for South Africa, its relevant ministries, to consider diversifying our trade network. I mean, ending trade with the US or being kicked out of AGOA does not mean that this is the end of trade. It simply means that we need to end the dependence or reliance on a single superpower, and we need to take advantage of the shifting global order or the balance of power globally. And we need to, for instance, look at what is our value in terms of geopolitics, and what diplomatic influence do we have, and how can we use that to our advantage, given that the US's power and influence in world politics is gradually waning or gradually declining.
And having said that, could the imposition of harsh tariffs then set a precedent where powerful economies dictate on African domestic policies through economic coercion?
Well, definitely, I believe that the US is using or is weaponizing tariffs, and not only in South Africa, but I believe that for all of its so-called enemies or its foes, it is using threat of tariffs, and mainly against countries that are involved in BRICS. But here's the key point that we should always consider in terms of the Trump administration's strategy of using tariffs in this manner, that all countries that are affected at some point will reach a consensus, and they will trade around the USA and find ways of trading without reliance or dependence on the USA. And in the long term, the USA might find that they'll find themselves isolated. And this might shift the global balance of power towards the east, towards, for instance, European countries, towards, for instance, China, Russia, India, Iran, and so on and so forth. So this strategy of weaponizing tariffs is not sustainable in the long term, as no country is an island, as we live in a globalized world in our contemporary political reality.
And for argument's sake, Mr. Mvenene, if alternative trade partnerships could be considered, it remains a question whether South Africa could mitigate US economic pressure by strengthening ties with other global partners like China, Russia, or the EU. I mean, the BRICS alliance provides sort of a counterweight to the Western economic dominance. Could this push African nations to seek stronger economic alliances with other global powers?
Well, definitely, because I think there is quite a number of African countries and specific African leaders who have argued publicly that China is a more attractive partner to deepen diplomacy and trade relations with, as opposed to the conditionality that come with having those kind of relations with the USA, especially when they tend to have presidents like Donald Trump, who just take these, these rash or even drastic actions which might hurt the USA in the long term. I mean, what is key here, what this moment teaches South Africa and our relevant ministries is that it is the importance of diversifying trade networks. We should extract maximally from our relations with the BRICS plus nations, like you said, European countries, and most importantly, we should take actions that make practical our core philosophy and our national objectives in our foreign policy, which speak to Pan-Africanism and South-South solidarity. We have, I believe, a free trade area within Africa, within SADC, and we should definitely make the most out of that and look towards other countries that view South Africa. For instance, the EU's EU Council President, Antonio Costa, argued that they view South Africa as an important trade partner, and we should not take this for granted. So we should definitely make the most out of our value, our geopolitical value, and our diplomatic influence within Africa and the broader global south.
And in the mix of this impending trade war between the United States and the third world, or you could say the emerging market economies, what role then does the African Union and SADC play in protecting member states from such economic pressures? I mean, where is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which could help reduce reliance on the Western markets?
Well, in essence, African countries are sleeping on the African Free Trade Area. They are not really taking, I would say, practical steps to extract maximally from the trade agreement. And I think that's mainly because African economies are more or less the same. They are extractive economies that export minerals or raw materials to other parts of the world. And I think the growing calls domestically and in other parts of the world for actually processing minerals and building a secondary sector as opposed to a very large tertiary sector and a primary sector is something that South Africa should really take faster moves towards implementing. And I mean, let's be realistic, this is global politics. I mean, South Africa or even African countries are not really, superpowers or anywhere close to being superpower states. And at the moment, the standoff is between the global East and the global West. And as the global South, mainly as Africa, who we align with then determines who wins this round of the battle between the East and the West. And we should side with whoever maximizes our national interest and our continental interest. Yes.
Mr. Venene, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I mean, as this is an ongoing conversation, we're yet to see how the other African countries will react if South Africa exceeds or, fends off the U.S. threats of harsh tariffs. Well, while Donald Trump's threats could be seen as an attempt to undermine South Africa's sovereignty, they also highlight the reality that economic power influences global politics. And South Africa's response, of course, whether it alters or stands by its land reform policies, will reflect its ability to sort of balance sovereignty with economic pragmatism. So joining us there for this conversation was Mbasa Venene, the senior lecturer at the Walter Sisulu University.